Hey, it's Elle. So today we're going to do a tag that is about the most influential books I have read. So this was originally created on Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading's channel. Her subscriber, Victoria M, created this. And then I was tagged forever ago by Gina. And I have been thinking about it ever since and kind of how I wanted to tackle this. So essentially it's just about, the books in your life that you've read, the top 10 books that have had the most impact on you. And I've been thinking about how I wanted to answer these questions because at first I thought, I don't even feel like I can answer this because I'm only 28 and this list will constantly be changing, right? Like I'm very young in my reading life. I only got back into reading at a pretty good pace about 5 years ago. So, if I kept at this pace for the rest of my life and assumed I lived a healthy one, I would be reading many more books, which means that some of these would get knocked off. And then I was trying to think about how I wanted to answer these because, for some people, it's like a book is a memory of a time and place and a moment in your life. And, you read the book at a right time where it makes you think about something different or maybe refreshes something for you. I'm not really that type of reader. As far as influencing my life, I don't really think it does that. So that's my roundabout way of saying, I guess, how I'm going to go about these answers. So I'm going to start with childhood because the way I'm going about answering this for childhood is a bit different. And then I'm going to move into my adult life. There's no prompts, but it says, think of the first book you read as a child. And I honestly don't have any childhood books, when I was very young, that I remember very well or feel very, they influenced me a lot. I think that the biggest influence is just how much my mom advocated for me to be a young reader, and she taught me to read when I was pretty young. I was already reading when I went into kindergarten. She kind of always advocated for having reading in my life, and I fell in love with it at a very young age. So I've been reading for a very long time. I think that the first books I want to talk about, which won't be surprising if you guess my age group, is the Harry Potter book. The first time I ever read the Harry Potter books, only the first 4 were out, and my mom actually read them to me every night as she was putting me in for bed. It's unfortunate what has come out about J.K. Rowling and her transphobic comments that she's made and how she's really excluded and marginalized an already marginalized community using her platform, because I don't really want to promote her on my channel because she has a huge audience and what she's doing is harmful. It's unfortunate because I don't really want to talk about Harry Potter as much, but it had such a huge positive impact on my life. So it's just very interesting, I think, how someone can maybe not be a good person, but they themselves or their actions can have a positive impact on you. For me, Harry Potter was my childhood. If you could see pictures of my room when I was growing up, there's Harry Potter posters everywhere. I had all of this Harry Potter paraphernalia. I had friendships that were made by having a joint love of the books and going to the midnight premieres of the movies and going to the midnight purchasings of the books and dressing up. And it was just such a huge part of my childhood from I think second grade when I first read the books until they ended and the last one came out. So as far as just childhood growing up, that would be the most influential. And I think for me at that age, I was reading for plot and reading for fantasy and also reading a bit more to find myself. And I, as a lot of young girls at the time did, really related to Hermione as a character. I'm a total know-it-all. She thinks she's right about everything and is kind of terse and smart about it. And I was totally like that. And still am a bit today. So yeah, I would say the first one would be Harry Potter. I think that for the second one, I want to talk about a book that I had to read for school when I was in high school, and it was one of the first ones that I read that I actually enjoyed as a reading experience, and that was The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I've reread this a few times since then and still really appreciate it. It's interesting because I wouldn't guess that I would like a war story. It's not my go-to, but how it's written, it's very straightforward and to the point. As a teenager, I felt like I could understand the concepts that were going on in it. It was one of the first books I read, and I was like, oh, I actually understand what's going on, and also really like the book. Next, we're going to be moving on into my adult reading, and how I framed this one is books that taught me something about my reading preferences. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Best of Roald Dahl, which is a short story collection of his. And this is what introduced me to the short story narrative and how well they could be done. When I read these, probably like 6 years ago, I loved them. They were eerie, they gave you just the right amount of detail, they kind of drew you in and then left you like wanting. I think that short stories can be done really well, and I think that it's easy to get them wrong, and for me this is like the best type of short story. Next one we're going to talk about, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This is a book in 6 parts, and it goes chronologically through time, and each part is following totally different characters, totally different times, and it goes chronologically in the future, and then it goes backward and kind of closes them all up. I just find this book to be such a masterpiece. I think that David Mitchell's ability to use the English language is hard to compare for me. I just find he bounced between genres, he bounced between writing styles and ideas and perspectives, and to be able to make them all feel like different voices is really incredible to me. So I think that this book kind of taught me how good, it's hard to say. For me, it taught me how good someone could write. Like, I didn't realize people could change their voice this much, and it's very impressive to me. Next one I'm going to go with is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. I loved this book. It's very dark. I guess I loved all of these books. It's dark. I think this is one of the first books I read that was translated. One of the things that happens when you read translated literature is that you read books that are set in a totally different culture, and it could come at the same ideas from a different perspective. So this one, the protagonist, the woman, decides to become a vegetarian, and that has a lot of cultural implications. So already, this is much different than it would be from my perspective. I was vegetarian for a while. I went to my family. These weren't the repercussions I experienced. Then this book also was told in 3 parts, and it was never the protagonist speaking. It was always someone else speaking for her, which also talked to a cultural context that was different but the same. And I think this book just taught me that it's because different places have different cultures and experiences and language and just different ways of evoking experience, emotion, etc. Reading translated literature can open me up to totally different reading experiences. So that is why this made it to the list. Next, we're going to go with The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. Helen Hoang is a Vietnamese American who is autistic. And this is an own voices of both of those things, which I really appreciated. I was one of those people who, for a while, that looked down on romance and thought of it as a lesser genre, which is points to internal misogynism I had that I didn't really recognize at the time, but I had heard so many good things about this that I decided to give it a try, and I loved it. I read it. I remember distinctly, I was on my way to Austin on a vacation, and I started it on the plane, and then I had to finish it once we got into town. It was like, I can't start enjoying myself until I finish this book. So I think that this one just opened me up to romances as a genre and the fact that I would enjoy reading some. I also really liked that the sex scenes were like things went wrong. Like it wasn't just like fireworks the first time. There was so much learning that had to be done, which is how life can look, and so I really appreciated that. We're gonna go There by Tommy Orange. I liked this book for many reasons, but I think what this informed me of my reading taste is I love a really good atmosphere, and I think an atmospheric read is something that a lot of the time we only associate with fantasies because they don't take place in a real life setting, and the author has to do a good job of building up this world so that you could understand it. And I think that the same exact thing can be said for fiction. I don't think every book has to have a strong atmosphere, but when it does, especially when it's a place that I've experienced and I can tell it's done well, it just heightens my appreciation of the book. So this takes place mainly in Oakland, and I grew up very close to Oakland, and Oakland felt like a living, breathing character on the pages of this book, and it made me almost nostalgic for the place because I don't live close to there now. I love finding books where the place feels like a character, and it's a hard thing because you don't always know unless you've spent time there. So I've read a book that took place in San Francisco when Dimple met Rishi, and I just kept shaking my head and being like, the converse can happen for me where I'm like, this isn't what the place is like, and it can be a hindrance if it's not done well or they get things wrong. But when it's done right, it's just a great experience for me. It's hard to find because it's hard to search for, but when I come across it, the next one is actually a bit interesting because it isn't because I liked the book, it's because I didn't. So that would be The Magicians by Lev Grossman. When I was young, I would not finish a lot of books I read for no reason. So I would start it, I would get a few chapters in, I would put it down, and I would never pick it up again. And that was a consistent theme through my childhood. If I didn't get through it in like one sitting, I didn't finish the book. And so when I got back into reading as an adult, I was like, I'm going to change this, I'm going to actively work on it, and I'm going to start reading books all the way through and become a completionist. And then that started working against me, where I was reading and finishing a lot of books I wasn't enjoying, especially because I was still trying to understand my adult reading tastes. And I had read a lot of books that I didn't like, and it put me in a lot of reading slumps. And then I started reading The Magicians by Lev Grossman, and I was like, nope. I got halfway through, and I was like, I know if I keep reading, I'm not going to enjoy this. I ended up looking up the synopsis, finding out what happened, being glad I didn't finish it because it didn't sound like it went anywhere interesting. And that was the turning point for me with DNFing. I didn't start getting to be quite the advocate I am today for it, but slowly over time, I started becoming more comfortable with DNFing books, and now I DNF all the time. I have many videos about it. I now don't read things that I'm not going to enjoy because I have tons of other books that I can get to. Next one is a nonfiction, and that is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This is everything I want a nonfiction to be. The scope, like what it's looking at and how the narrowness, it's wide, but it's narrow. So it's mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. The scope is not too big and it's not too small. It's like it's a Goldilocks for me. It's just right. It's focusing in on something. We're not giving the whole history of something. It's not too wide. I'm getting just enough detail. So that's the first part that I really appreciate. And the second part is the actual writing. She would set up a chapter which had a concept. And then she would have paragraphs or sections that would have an idea she was going to prove. And then she would go through with data and kind of she would give data and give correlations and then kind of prove her point in these smaller sections, and then all of these smaller sections would kind of prove the idea of the chapter. I read some nonfiction, and it's definitely not a big part of my reading, but it has become bigger as time has gone on. I read a lot of nonfiction and philosophy when I was in a few classes in college, and my favorite part of those books wasn't the actual philosophies, it was how they tried to prove those to me. Whether or not I agreed with them was not really the part of the experience that I was drawn towards. I found the subject matter to be highly interesting, highly important as it was, and recommend everyone read it. But also the way that she proved her points was great. This is like an A+ nonfiction for me. I don't think it can get better than this as far as writing goes. As far as academic writing goes, I should say. This is the one that kind of shows me what I like in nonfiction. So the last one is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. So I read the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire series years ago. And then I started the second one and I DNF'd it. And this is one of those instances where it just wasn't the right time. I was in a conservation corps. I was working 10-hour days and then like of manual labor and then sleeping for most of the night. So just if I needed something at that time that was a bit more high pace, fast paced and interesting, and this I would not call fast-paced. I mean, they're chonkers. There's a lot of detail in these. And I decided to pick them back up again. And I know I put Harry Potter on this list, but that's like a low fantasy. And I kind of thought it was like a one-off that I really liked that series because I didn't read many series in my adult reading up until now. And I didn't gravitate towards high fantasy. And then I started reading these, and I was really having to push through them. But then I got to the third book and found that I was really enjoying them, and I was enjoying learning about the new world. And this one doesn't really have much magic, but I was enjoying the process of reading a fantasy, and I was like, this is interesting, because I actually thought I wasn't a fantasy reader. So it kind of just made me rethink if I was a fantasy reader or a series reader or not. And since I read this and finished that series mid last year, I've now gone on to read many series and high fantasy series and quite enjoy them. And now it's a large part of my reading. So those are all the books I have. Thank you, Gina, for tagging me, and I'm sorry it took so long to do, but I've actually been thinking about this for quite a while. Anyone who wants to do this, feel free. I would be really intrigued to see pay at attention's answers to these, because I haven't really gotten a grip on his reading style or the types of genres he really enjoys, so I would be interested to hear from him, but anyone can do this. If you don't have a channel and you want to answer the questions, feel free to pop them down below, but that's all I got, so until next time, happy reading.